During dinner with my fiancée's parents, they said I could marry her only if I transferred my house and half my salary. She smiled and whispered, "I'm worth a lot." She'd find out tomorrow what I really signed. The night I drove to Sabrina's parents' house, I told myself it was just dinner, an introduction, a simple formality before the wedding. I wore the navy suit she liked, the one that made me look trustworthy, as she once joked. The mansion stood on a hill outside the city, lit like a hotel lobby. The kind of house where every window had the same heavy drapes and every light was the same shade of calculated warmth. When I pulled up, I saw 3 cars already there. Her father's black Range Rover, her mother's white Lexus, and an unfamiliar sedan that looked rented. I didn't think much of it until later. Inside, Sabrina greeted me with her usual polished charm, the kind that belonged to someone raised to treat affection like currency. She kissed me once on the cheek, then quickly checked her reflection in a mirror before leading me into the dining room. Her parents sat waiting at a long table that looked more like a boardroom than a place for family meals. The dinner began with polite conversation, travel plans, my work as a civil engineer, their daughter's upcoming responsibilities as a wife. Her father, Gregory, had the kind of tone that made everything sound like a contract negotiation. Her mother, Florence, nodded at everything he said, correcting her wine glass placement twice, but never once looking me directly in the eye. Halfway through the main course, the atmosphere changed. Gregory leaned back, wiped his mouth, and said he wanted to discuss arrangements. I assumed he meant wedding logistics. He didn't. He gestured to a folder beside him. The papers inside were neatly stacked, clipped, and tabbed. He spoke slowly, like a man used to being obeyed. According to him, Sabrina's long-term security needed to be protected. He proposed that I transfer the deed of my house, the one I bought before we even met, into Florence's name. He called it a trust gesture. He went on to suggest that half my salary be redirected to a shared account, one that Sabrina's parents could manage responsibly. For a moment, I genuinely thought it was a joke. I waited for Sabrina to laugh. She didn't. She kept her eyes on her plate, smiling faintly, her hand brushing the stem of her wine glass. I tried to find a trace of embarrassment, a hint of protest, but all I saw was quiet agreement. I asked if this was their idea of tradition or if I was just the wrong kind of son-in-law. Gregory didn't flinch. He said that love was emotional, but marriage was financial. Florence added that Sabrina was raised a certain way and deserved to live accordingly. Then, as if rehearsed, Sabrina finally spoke. She said it wasn't about control, it was about reassurance. She told me not to take it personally. The room felt smaller. The chandelier hummed above like a fly trapped inside glass. I realized then that I was outnumbered. 3 people sitting across from me, already convinced of their own righteousness. Gregory slid a pen toward me. The contract, he explained, wasn't binding yet, just a statement of intent. I read enough to see my house's address printed in bold. My chest tightened, but I forced a smile. I asked for another glass of wine. When Gregory nodded to the maid, I took the moment to sign something. Not the contract itself, but a blank sheet from the folder's back. I made sure he saw the motion of the pen, the flourish of a signature, the confident posture of compliance. It was theater, but I knew the audience well. Sabrina's eyes lit up with something smug and satisfied. Florence clapped her hands once softly and said it was a good beginning. Gregory folded the papers, slid them back into the folder, and looked pleased. The rest of dinner blurred together. Florence talked about venues. Gregory discussed investments. Sabrina mentioned how her friends were so impressed with how mature I'd become lately. I smiled through it all, nodding at the right times, pretending my thoughts weren't circling like wolves. When dessert arrived, I noticed Sabrina's phone light up beside her plate. The reflection in her glass revealed a text, a message preview from someone named Mitch. It read he bought it. She quickly flipped the phone over, pretending to adjust her napkin. That was the first crack in the mask. When the evening finally ended, I thanked them for dinner. Gregory shook my hand with the grip of a man claiming ownership. Florence hugged me lightly, perfumed and cold. Sabrina walked me to the front door. On the porch, she leaned close enough for me to smell her perfume again. Sharp, expensive, unfamiliar. She whispered that she was proud of me, that not every man would agree to something so adult. Then she said the words that stayed burned in my head. I'm worth a lot. I nodded, watching her eyes flicker with self-satisfaction. I told her she'd find out tomorrow what I really signed. She laughed, thinking it was another one of my dry jokes. The moment I got in my car, I drove straight to the office of my lawyer, a friend from college named Ron who owed me a favor. He opened the door in sweatpants, half asleep, but once he saw my expression, he sobered up. I told him everything. The dinner, the contract, the tone in Gregory's voice. He didn't laugh. He told me I'd walked into a trap dressed as a family dinner. We spent the next 3 hours drafting something far more powerful than a contract. A series of conditional transfers, trust protections, and loopholes so precise they could turn a simple signature into a fortress. Every clause, every date, every word was designed to look ordinary while reversing control. By the time I drove home, it was nearly dawn. My hands smelled faintly of ink and paper. I stood outside my house for a while, staring at it under the streetlight. The place wasn't just a building anymore, it was bait. Inside, I noticed Sabrina's purse on the counter, her jacket draped carelessly over the couch. She was asleep upstairs, the glow of her phone screen pulsing faintly through the bedroom door. For a second, I considered checking it, finding out who Mitch was. But then I realized I didn't need to. Whatever game they were playing, I had already joined it. I just hadn't told them that the rules were about to change. That night, I slept for 3 hours. When I woke, I felt no panic, only precision. The dinner hadn't been an ending. It was the opening move. And the next move would make sure they'd never forget the cost of that single sentence. I'm worth a lot. The morning after that dinner, Sabrina acted as though everything had gone perfectly. She made pancakes, kissed my cheek, and talked about wedding colors while humming to herself. I watched her move around the kitchen, light as a feather, as if the night before hadn't been a transaction disguised as a conversation. She believed the deal was done. I could see it in the way she spoke, the way she moved, confident, relaxed, untouchable. She didn't ask to see the papers again, which told me something important. She'd already taken a photo of what she thought I'd signed. 2 hours later, her mother texted me thanking me for my maturity. I hadn't even told her I agreed to anything. That was when I knew they'd started spreading the word, testing how easily they could turn a lie into fact. Gregory called that evening, his tone oddly friendly. He said he'd put in a good word with a friend at the country club for me to join as a member. He sounded generous, magnanimous. But every favor he offered was another hook. I played along, keeping my voice steady, agreeing to everything. A few days later, I noticed small changes. Sabrina's parents began stopping by my house unannounced, walking through rooms, making comments about future renovations. Florence asked if the kitchen could fit a larger island, as if it were hers. Sabrina didn't stop them. She just smiled, watching me for any sign of resistance. I gave them none. At work, I started moving pieces quietly. Ron had drawn up a trust in my sister Marianne's name. It looked like a basic financial safety net, but in reality, it gave her control of every major asset I owned, my house, my car, even my future bonuses. On paper, it looked like I was simply being responsible. In practice, it meant that even if Sabrina or her family somehow forced a transfer, they'd get nothing but a legal wall. The following weekend, Sabrina claimed she had a bridal planning trip with her friends. I asked a few light questions, and she got defensive immediately, too defensive for something harmless. She left early Saturday, saying she'd be back Sunday night. She returned Monday morning, exhausted but glowing, with a new handbag that cost more than my first car. When I asked how the trip went, she said it was productive. That night, while she showered, I scrolled through her public social media. Nothing unusual, nothing direct. She was too smart for that. But one of her friends, Tara, posted a story from an expensive rooftop restaurant in Miami, captioned, "To future Mrs. S. Cheers to freedom before the leash tightens." Sabrina's reflection appeared faintly in the glass. It wasn't anger I felt. It was calculation. I started leaving subtle traces of my own, hints that I was distracted, stressed, maybe even careless. Sabrina loved feeling smarter than everyone around her. I let her think she was. I mentioned to her father that I had started filing the transfer paperwork and that it should clear soon. He immediately offered to connect me with their family lawyer, which was exactly what I wanted. Their lawyer, a slick man named Derek, met me for coffee 2 days later. He pretended it was casual, but he carried the weight of someone sent to verify obedience. He asked for my signature on what he called supplemental forms. I told him I already submitted my own filings with the county office, but I'd be happy to share copies. He smiled politely, hiding irritation. Meanwhile, Ron finalized the real documents. They looked identical to the ones Gregory had drawn up, except for a few buried clauses. The new version transferred ownership to Marion Holt Trust Holdings, which could not be altered without my consent. Anyone reading it casually would assume I'd followed Gregory's terms. I waited. One evening, Sabrina invited me to dinner with her parents again. This time, the tone was completely different. They were relaxed, laughing, pouring wine like old friends. Florence complimented my willingness to adapt. Gregory toasted to a man who understands what family means. It was nauseating, but I clinked glasses anyway. After dessert, Gregory mentioned their upcoming loan application for a minor expansion project. He said the bank required proof of stable assets. He looked directly at me as he said it. That's when I understood everything. They weren't just greedy, they were desperate. Their business was sinking, and my property was supposed to be the life raft. I didn't react. I simply said I'd make sure all paperwork reached the registry before the end of the week. That night, I met with Ron again. We updated the trust filing to include a delayed disclosure, meaning, for several days, the registry would display transfer pending, giving the illusion that Sabrina's mother's name was incoming. By the time the actual records appeared, the assets would already belong to the trust permanently. 2 days later, Sabrina's parents held a small cocktail party to celebrate the deal being finalized. They hadn't even confirmed it. I attended, keeping a straight face while they introduced me to their friends as the perfect son-in-law. I caught Sabrina watching me across the room, her smile almost predatory. Tara showed up halfway through, slightly drunk. She greeted me with exaggerated warmth, saying I was a good sport. When Sabrina walked away for a moment, Tara leaned close and whispered that Sabrina was lucky I was so trusting. The words carried a different tone, not admiration, but pity. Later that night, I found Sabrina in the study on the phone with her father. I couldn't hear much, only fragments. Yes, he signed it. Yes, everything's moving forward. Her voice was calm, confident. That confidence was useful. It meant she still had no idea what I'd done. The next morning, I visited Gregory's office under the pretext of discussing investment opportunities. He was in good spirits, shaking my hand too tightly, talking about how proud he was to see a young man stepping up. I noticed a loan officer waiting outside his office, briefcase in hand. Gregory excused himself to meet with him, saying it was just a small formality. Through the half-open door, I overheard a sentence that froze me mid-step. Yes, the house is already pledged. Collateral's handled. So that was it. My property, my home, had been used to secure their loan before the documents even existed publicly. It was all smoke, all confidence and manipulation, just like Sabrina's smile. That evening, I went home and poured a drink. Sabrina was upstairs packing an overnight bag for another wedding errand. I asked her casually if she needed the car. She said she'd take an Uber. Less attention. When she left, I opened my laptop and checked the public records portal. The transfer pending notice had gone live. Everything was in motion. 3 days from now, Gregory's bank would process his loan using an assumption that my house belonged to them. 4 days from now, the registry would refresh, and their names would vanish, replaced by the trust I created. And 5 days from now, Sabrina's family would learn what it felt like to build their empire on paper that wasn't theirs. But that was later. For now, I just sat in the quiet living room, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The house around me was still mine, every inch of it. They thought they were taking possession. They didn't know it was already a trap. 5 days later, the invitations came. A family celebration, as Sabrina's mother called it. Gregory's email described it as an intimate dinner to commemorate the successful union of our families, legally and emotionally. The irony almost made me laugh. I knew exactly what they were celebrating. Gregory's loan had just been approved that morning, based on collateral he never owned. Sabrina was glowing. She spent the afternoon at the salon, came home with her hair styled, and ordered a designer dress on rush delivery. She said it was our big night. She didn't realize it would be hers alone. The dinner was held at the Oak Ridge Country Club, the kind of place with staff trained to smile silently and tables that smelled faintly of money. About 20 people were there. Gregory and Florence, their business partners, a few of Sabrina's friends, and my sister Marianne, whom I had invited deliberately. Ron sat beside her, pretending to be her date, but actually acting as my silent witness. Gregory was in full performance mode, moving from guest to guest, shaking hands, laughing too loudly. He kept referring to me as the future of our family. Florence stood nearby, making sure everyone heard. Sabrina leaned close to me, whispering how happy she was that everything had worked out. Her perfume was thick enough to choke on. I smiled, watching her toast to a future that didn't exist. After dinner, Gregory called for attention. He raised his glass, announcing that the merger of love and legacy between our families marked a new chapter. People clapped. Sabrina placed her hand on my arm like a queen claiming her throne. Then the first tremor came. Gregory's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it mid-sentence and froze. His grin faltered just slightly, like a photograph slipping out of focus. He excused himself with an awkward laugh, muttering something about an important client. Florence followed, frowning. I stayed seated, sipping my drink. I knew exactly what he was reading. The registry had just updated. The transfer pending notice was gone, replaced by the official record, property owned by the Marion Holt Trust Holdings. Sabrina, oblivious, kept talking to Tara, bragging about how her parents were planning to build an addition on our home. I watched her for a moment. The way she tilted her head while she spoke, the way she smiled when people listened. She wasn't stupid. She just thought she was untouchable. A few minutes later, Gregory returned, his face pale, phone clutched tight. Florence trailed behind him, whispering frantically. He walked straight to me. His voice was low, shaking but trying to sound calm. He asked what I'd done. I told him to sit down, and I'd explain. The room quieted. Everyone sensed something was wrong. Sabrina frowned, confused. I said, in the calmest tone I could manage, that there had been a small, administrative mix-up. The property had indeed been transferred, but to a family trust, for tax reasons. Gregory demanded to know whose trust. I told him it was in my sister's name for now, but I'd be happy to include Sabrina later, after the wedding, of course. Florence's voice cut through the air, high and sharp. She said this wasn't what we agreed on. I reminded her there had been no official agreement, only a gesture over dinner. I turned to the crowd and explained that I was surprised they'd used my private finances to secure a business loan, a loan I discovered just days earlier. The room went silent. The partners shifted in their seats. Tara set her glass down, eyes darting between faces. Gregory's composure cracked. He said it was a misunderstanding, that no loan had been finalized. I looked at him, then at the banker seated across the room, the same man I'd seen in his office earlier that week. The banker's eyes widened as realization dawned. That's when it unraveled. The banker quietly excused himself to make a call. Florence tried to smooth things over, claiming I was overreacting. Sabrina started to panic. She whispered that we could fix it, that maybe there had been a filing error. I told her calmly there hadn't been any error, not this time. She went pale, and then the third twist landed. Ron, who had been silent all evening, stood up and handed Gregory a manila folder. Inside were copies of the transfer forms Gregory and Florence had both signed 2 weeks ago. I told them they were verification documents to show intent of ownership, simple placeholders. They hadn't bothered reading the fine print. Those forms didn't transfer my house. They transferred the deed of their vacation home in Charleston, the one listed under a shell company owned by Florence, into the trust one controlled. All completely legal, all witnessed, all notarized. Gregory's voice cracked when he realized it. He demanded to know how I could do something so deceitful. I told him I learned from the best. The entire table erupted. Florence began shouting, calling me names that barely made sense. Sabrina stood frozen, shaking her head, whispering that it couldn't be real. Then Tara, in an act of either drunken guilt or spite, blurted out the truth they'd tried to keep buried. Sabrina had been planning to divorce me after the honeymoon, with her parents' full support. The idea was to push for joint ownership first, then claim half of everything I had. Gregory turned to her in shock, but she didn't stop. She said Sabrina had laughed about it, saying she'd cash out before our first anniversary. That was when Sabrina finally lost it. She lunged toward Tara, screaming, calling her a liar. A waiter tried to step in, and a glass shattered on the floor. The quiet dinner had turned into a spectacle. I stayed seated, watching. The banker came back moments later, whispering something to Gregory that made his face collapse entirely. Their loan was suspended, pending review. The property they'd pledged as collateral was no longer theirs. The deal was dead before it began. Florence sat down hard, clutching her purse like it could save her. Sabrina stared at me, tears cutting through her makeup, repeating that she hadn't known, that it wasn't her plan, it was her parents'. But I'd heard enough lies for one lifetime. When I stood, the entire room fell silent again. I said only one thing, that I hoped everyone here understood the difference between worth and cost. Then I left. Outside, the air was cool, the sky heavy with clouds. Ron followed me to the parking lot. He asked if I was okay. I told him I'd never been clearer. The plan had worked, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like equilibrium, the kind you reach when a weight finally shifts off your chest. As I drove home, I passed a billboard advertising Gregory's company. The slogan read, "Integrity is everything." I laughed once quietly. When I pulled into my driveway, Sabrina's car was already there. She was sitting on the porch steps, barefoot, makeup streaked, still wearing her dress. She asked if we could talk. I told her to come inside, not to reconcile, but to listen. I explained that I'd already sold my share in the house. The trust had been restructured. Even if she somehow tried to claim it, there was nothing left to take. I didn't yell, didn't gloat. I simply told her that she had traded love for leverage, and lost both. She said she hadn't meant for it to go that far. I believed her, but belief didn't erase damage. When she left that night, she didn't slam the door. She just closed it softly behind her. Inside the quiet, I realized what I'd really signed that night at her parents' house wasn't a document. It was the end of illusion. The next day, Gregory's company's website went offline. Their accounts were frozen pending investigation. And the Charleston Vacation Homes title transfer posted publicly. I didn't need to read the comments, but I did anyway. For once, the world was watching them burn. The morning after the dinner, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Missed calls, voicemails, and text messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Some were from Gregory's business partners, others from friends who'd attended the dinner and wanted to check in. Even Sabrina had tried calling twice before giving up. I didn't answer any of them. I just watched the notifications pile up, each one another thread of their unraveling. By noon, the story had already spread. Gregory's company's loan had been suspended indefinitely, pending a fraud review. The bank had discovered that the collateral listed, my house, wasn't theirs to pledge. And when they tried to substitute another property, they found that the Charleston Vacation Home was no longer under their control either. That single discovery triggered a full audit. Within hours, half of Gregory's clients pulled out. Meanwhile, Florence posted a carefully worded message online about unforeseen legal delays. She tried to sound calm, but people who lived in that world, investors, lenders, the kind who could smell blood, weren't fooled. The damage was irreversible. Sabrina showed up at my house that evening. She didn't knock at first, just stood outside in the rain, soaked and trembling. I only noticed her when the doorbell camera buzzed. I should have ignored it, but curiosity won. When I opened the door, she looked smaller, not physically, but in presence. The confidence she once carried had vanished. Her mascara had run down her cheeks, and her hands shook as she spoke. She said her parents blamed her for everything, that Gregory had screamed at her for hours, calling her the weak link. Florence hadn't spoken to her all day. She begged me to talk to the bank, to clarify that it was just a misunderstanding. I listened quietly. There was no anger left, only exhaustion. She asked if I'd planned everything from the start, as if I were some kind of villain. I told her no, that I'd planned at the moment she let her parents turn our relationship into a business deal. She said she'd made a mistake, that she didn't know they were using my house as collateral. I reminded her of the text message from Mitch and her smug line at dinner. I'm worth a lot. Her face twisted when she heard it. She said she didn't mean it that way. But words have weight, and hers had already crushed the bridge between us. When she asked if I could forgive her, I told her something that surprised even me. Forgiveness wasn't the issue anymore. It was trust. Once it's gone, nothing grows in its place. She stood there for a few seconds, staring at me, then turned and walked away without another word. That night, I went upstairs, packed a small bag, and slept on the couch. I didn't want to be in the same bed where I'd once imagined a future with her. 2 days later, Ron called. Gregory's company had officially defaulted. The bank was freezing assets, and investigations had begun into how they'd obtained prior loans. The Charleston Vacation Home was now legally mine through the trust, and Ron asked what I wanted to do with it. I told him to sell it immediately. I didn't want trophies, I wanted closure. The sale went through in less than a week. I transferred most of the profit to Marianne's account, the rest into a new investment fund under my own name, one without ties to anyone. Meanwhile, Sabrina tried to contact me again, this time through mutual friends. She'd moved out of her parents' estate after a fight and was staying with Tara. Word spread quickly. The family's wealth had been a facade for years. Their company's debts were larger than anyone had imagined. The mansion was under lien, their vehicles repossessed. I heard Gregory had collapsed during a meeting and been hospitalized briefly, not from illness, but from stress. Florence, stripped of her social status, began selling jewelry online. And Sabrina, once the untouchable daughter of privilege, had started working as an assistant at a construction firm. I didn't plan to see her again, but fate, or irony, had other ideas. 2 months later, during a project bid meeting downtown, the firm hosting us assigned an assistant to coordinate documents. When she walked into the room, I froze. It was Sabrina. Her hair was tied back, her makeup minimal, her clothes plain. For a brief second, our eyes met, and I saw the flash of recognition, followed by humiliation. She didn't speak to me directly. She just passed me the forms, her hands trembling slightly. Her supervisor introduced her without knowing the history, calling her our newest team member, very hardworking. I nodded politely, said thank you, and signed the papers. When I handed them back, I noticed her engagement ring finger was bare. After the meeting, she waited near the elevators. She asked if we could talk for 5 minutes, somewhere private. I agreed, more out of curiosity than sympathy. We stepped into an empty conference room. She said she was trying to rebuild, that she'd learned her lesson, that she wasn't the same person. She wanted to know if there was even a small chance to start over someday, not as lovers, just as people who could look each other in the eye again. I told her I hoped she did rebuild, but not for me, for herself. Because rebuilding means nothing if it's just to prove someone wrong. She nodded slowly, tears forming again. She asked if I'd ever think about what we could have been. I said I already had, and that's exactly why I stopped. When she left the room, I felt no satisfaction, no anger, just a strange calm. The kind that follows when every piece finally lands where it belongs. Weeks turned into months. Gregory's company declared bankruptcy. Their mansion was auctioned off for a fraction of its value. I didn't attend, but Ron sent me a photo. The once grand house now stripped of furniture, the driveway cracked with weeds. Marianne used part of the sale money from Charleston to open a small design studio. I helped her set it up, quietly funding the first few months' rent. She told me she was proud of me. I said I was just tired. One evening, I sat in my new apartment overlooking the city. The skyline glowed in the distance, silent, indifferent, unbothered by the ruins of someone else's schemes. On my desk sat the same pen Gregory had pushed across the table that night at dinner. I kept it, not as a reminder of revenge, but as proof that control can shift with something as simple as ink and patience. Sometimes I'd think about that dinner, about how easily love had been traded for leverage. Maybe Sabrina had never truly loved me. Or maybe she did once, before her parents taught her to measure affection in assets. Either way, I'd learned something valuable, that people who say I'm worth a lot are usually talking about everything except what actually matters. The world didn't end for them. It just shrank. They went from owning everything to owning nothing. From speaking loudly to being whispered about. That's worse than punishment. That's erasure. As for me, I didn't celebrate. I just lived, worked, slept. The taste of vengeance fades fast, but peace lingers. One night, months later, I received a letter forwarded through Ron. It was from Sabrina. No apologies this time, no excuses. Just a single page with one sentence. You were right about worth. I folded it carefully, placed it in a drawer, and closed it without a word. Outside, rain began to fall again. The same kind as that night she stood on my porch, begging for a chance that no longer existed. This time, I didn't open the door.